You can give them your data, but if you let them control the key, then you may as well have given them signature control. So the public and the cloud zone, we believe it should not store user credentials, but if the data in the cloud is already public data, then it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter. So that's a gray line over there. Communication between the zones is always in one direction, and this is a security requirement. You never ever want a port opening up from the cloud into your control zone. You always want it going from the control zone into the cloud. Even if if you need data from the cloud, the control zone application has to pull it from the cloud. So this way, if the cloud ever gets compromised, if your image, if your application in the cloud is compromised, the attacker has no ability to get back into your control zone. If you wanted to, you can use client authentication, which is a higher level of security that goes beyond SSL.
So I'm trying to understand the previous one that you just said, where
Which is?
Yeah, the communications always comes from the trusted zone, or the regulated zone.
Correct.
So you have your device, your user that's starting off a session. How does the regulated zone know to start off that session if there isn't incoming traffic from the user?
So the incoming traffic, the first session, the start will always happen to the regulated zone. The web application here authenticates the individual, establishes a session identifier, and through a web service notifies the application in the cloud that a particular session identifier is active. The
This was initiated by the user.
Yeah, this was initiated by the user.
Inbound initiated traffic.
Inbound into the regulated zone, but the regulated zone is now telling the cloud that a particular session is valid. And the web application in the cloud, in its memory, holds on to session identifiers for a while, knowing that these are active identifiers. When the transaction then goes into the cloud, the browser carries the session identifier with it in the HTTP headers. The web application verifies that the session identifier is a valid one before it will accept the data, and that session identifier or transaction identifier ties the transaction together. The point is, the data can be going in any direction, but if the data has to come from the cloud into the regulated zone, the transaction has to be initiated from this side to pull it down.
But I think the point that he is trying to make is that there are inbound connections still happening from the user, and so how do you keep that from being the attack vector versus the attack coming from the cloud? I'm not sure why the cloud.
That you can never prevent.
Well, but
That you cannot. I mean, you can never prevent an attack coming from the user's PC itself.
Well, that's a huge issue. Like, I have my X-ray, and my X-ray machine pops it up on the screen. I press the button and think it's going to the control zone, but really it's going to some random whatever. That's like a major thing. If I can't see what's going, because you say it's all transparent, that's actually an
But
issue.
see, that's a completely different security issue and a different attack vector.
Yeah.
If your session is being redirected somewhere else, you've got a different type of an attack going on. Your DNS has probably been compromised, more than likely, or your session has been hijacked.
Yeah.
So those are, I mean, things that happen in the user's PC, they're not under consideration or under control here.
Or said another way, let's just be thankful that the regulators are either too ignorant or too savvy to realize we can't control them.
Exactly. I think it's actually the latter.
You pay the right auditors, you know.
No, I mean, if they had to control the PCI, I mean, there were a lot of discussions a couple of years ago about what about the credit card data in the browser on the user's PC, and they said, nope, that's not under scope, because if they had to control that, all e-commerce would have had to shut down.
Oh, but most better websites would actually forward you somewhere else to put your credit card in. They won't even host the form to type in your credit card.
Or it's
for that
free.
very reason. The problem is just you don't know who you're actually typing it in unless you actually check the certificate.
URL and all of
And
that.
that's been hacked also. So.
So the user session is not under discussion here. So if the
I
attack
was-
is
I was
coming
actually-
from here,
I was actually commenting on you had a bullet there that said you weren't going to allow inbound traffic. And
Yep.
I think that's not doable. I think you have to have inbound traffic.
from the cloud into the regulated zone,
I think a user out in the internet is in the cloud. You can't differentiate, unless you're saying you're not going to allow inbound traffic from your particular cloud location.
yep, that's exactly what I'm saying. So the user may have initiated a transaction that began in the cloud, but the browser and the application knew that there was sensitive data that needed to be decrypted. So the browser redirects here with a session identifier and some code that says this file or this object needs to be decrypted. A web service will go and pick it up from there, decrypt it, and then display it in the browser.
And if you're saying, okay.
The-
So, right. Any user that's going to be using the system, so that means you have a lot of IP addresses that you're going to allow to come in. And the same thing goes if you're talking about cloud. The traditional sense of the cloud is your data actually is in multiple locations and can be coming down from many different IP addresses at different times. Still struggle with that a little bit.
Yeah, I know what you're saying now.
But you're initiating the connection from here, so you're only going to be going to your cloud, and it's a URL. You're not even going to care about the IP address. So if you were getting it from Amazon, for example, it would actually be a URL, the object. And your firewalls would allow that to go out and get that object. The request for that object from your application here was initiated by the user transaction. So yes, you are correct that the transaction was initiated by the user on the internet, but because the transaction involved sensitive data that needed to be decrypted, the application knew that the control must go into the regulated zone so that the regulated zone can pull the file down, decrypt it, and then display the data on the browser.
I think these are really two different things.
I think that maybe mine might be a little bit more off topic if you want to come back to it, but I was just wondering about the scalability issues.
Scalability of this
Of
environment?
This model, yeah, because then.
So it depends
everything
on
has
the
to-
application, Tatiana. So it all depends on the application and the transaction. If it's an e-commerce application, it's significantly smaller issue because you're only focused on protecting, without a doubt, the credit card number, the credentials, session identifiers, transaction identifiers, and perhaps some additional identification data. Healthcare, different data set, so it's a different problem. But once again, it's still possible to do RC3 in the healthcare environment depending on what you choose to put in the cloud. My feeling is people who are conservative are going to take baby steps into this. No one's going to go rushing out there and say, I'm going to put my whole thing into the cloud. Pfizer apparently did a major R&D project in Amazon.
Yeah,
It was written up.
Yeah, well,
But they completely tokenized everything.
well, yeah, so basically all anonymized. It's basically a
Exactly.
anonymized genome data.
Exactly.
Just been actually speaking at a conference related to that cloud, health cloud, and everyone who was presenting, the only security measure they had was that there was basically no
Anonymization.
No
And
PHI on the cloud.
when you think about it, it's RC3 in batch mode. That's what they were doing.
Not really. They were actually stripping everything out because they didn't care. They said, I just want to have 1 million genomes to mine and figure out what the human looks like when we tweak this.
So they were not interested in
There was no
identifying.
PHI. There was no PHI in the
There you
cloud.
go. So it is possible then.
Yeah, I know exactly that project actually. They were speaking there and saying that's how they did it. In fact, I know a bunch of valley companies that do the same thing. They just avoid the regulated data
Okay.
altogether on the cloud. Sort of the I forward to
And the reason for that particular approach is because there is no assurance that the data is safe in the cloud. Now, whether this architecture might have worked for the project or not, it's hard to tell because I don't know what's sensitive and what's not.
Yeah.
But they made the decision. They went to the other extreme. They just cut off all the sensitive data and processed the remaining in the cloud,
All of
which
them did
is,
that.
in a way, it's Still RC3, they just chose not to store or process the sensitive data anywhere.